So maybe you've seen this video clip or heard someone making this argument. If you have, first of all, I'm sorry. This is a horribly fallacious argument that falls apart under even light scrutiny. Here's the video clip.
Do not believe that just because you're opposed to abortion that makes you pro-life. In fact, I think in many cases your morality is deeply lacking. If all you want is a child born, but not a child fed, not a child educated, not a child housed, and why would I think that you don't? Because you don't want any tax money to go there. That's not pro-life, that's pro-birth. We need a much broader conversation on what the morality of pro-life is.
The argument basically states that if you are against taxpayer-funded welfare and support programs that are allegedly designed to help poor families, in this case, namely young children, then you can't call yourself pro-life. You must instead refer to yourself only as pro-birth. This argument assumes a few things that simply aren't true. The first one being that welfare programs actually help poor families. There are mountains of evidence and studies that show otherwise. They show that welfare programs not only don't work how they're claimed to, but they perpetuate and incentivize poverty. Take a look at this chart. It graphs data provided by federal government agencies that track the percentage of individuals living in poverty by the government's own poverty standard from 1947 to 2012. As you can see, the poverty rate steadily drops from 1947 to around 1973. From then, it stops falling and more or less levels off. Now, it's important to note that before the mid to late 60s, most forms of welfare in this country were handled through voluntary means via private charities, fraternal organizations, and other such means. Beginning in 1964, a series of large federal welfare programs known as the Great Society legislation was put in place. Most of its programs were fully implemented by the end of the decade. And make no mistake, these were massive programs for their time. There was no way that the after effects of these programs, whatever they may be, were going to go unnoticed. Well, it's now 50 years and 15 trillion taxpayer dollars later. That's trillion with a T, by the way. And the effects are clearly visible. By this and nearly every other measure, it just didn't work, and in many cases appears to be wildly counterproductive. If poverty was dropping steadily when we had very little government intervention, and then stopped falling after the expansion of the welfare state, how can Sister Chittister claim that those who don't support tax-funded welfare programs to be, quote-unquote, deeply lacking in their moral conviction? If anything, an argument could be made that those who support government welfare programs to be the ones who need to examine their morals, for two reasons. The first one being that the systematic theft of the welfare state is itself immoral, and the second one being that the theft doesn't even help anyone. Despite all the hard evidence, leftists still claim that government welfare programs are the only feasible way to help poor families. And if you're against them, then, well, you must not care about poor families. This fallacious argument is just one version of a series of arguments that claim if government doesn't provide X, then it won't be provided, and disastrous result Y will occur. The same basic framework of this argument is constantly recycled by leftists in order to try and shame people into believing that they're selfish misanthropes for disagreeing with government solutions. Don't want government health care? Then you must want people to die in the streets. Don't want government schools? Then you must want people to be stupid. Don't want government gun control? Then you must want people to shoot each other. Don't want government drug prohibition? Then you must want people to become junkies. Don't want government forcing labor union membership? You must want workers to be exploited. And so on. And I'm not just glibly or casually picking these aforementioned examples. In each and every one, there is a wealth of factual, historical information that shows government intervention in those areas has made things worse. Healthcare before major government intervention was readily available and was actually dropping in cost. Before the debut of compulsory education around the turn of the 20th century, Americans were highly educated and literate. Gun control has been disastrous in terms of preventing violence, actually doing the exact opposite. The war on drugs has been a colossal failure, which has led to dangerous black markets and gang violence, to say the least. Workers across the entire 19th century, from 1800 to 1900, saw their wages quadruple, and only 3% of them were unionized in 1900. 19th century French economist Frédéric Bastiat knew this kind of argument very well. In his short book, The Law, he had this to say: "Socialism, like the ancient ideas from which it springs, confuses the distinction between government and society. As a result of this, every time we object to a thing being done by government, the socialists conclude that we object to its being done at all. We disapprove of state education. Then the socialists say we are opposed to any education. We object to a state religion. Then the socialists say we want no religion at all. We object to state-enforced equality. Then they say we are against equality, and so on and so on. It is as if the socialists were to accuse us of not wanting persons to eat, because we do not want the state to raise grain. So if we're against all these things because we don't want government handling them, what about all the things that government hasn't put its hands on yet? For instance, today, the government does not guarantee or provide everyone with an automobile. If one were to express an opinion right now that he or she doesn't think the government should provide automobiles to all citizens, almost nobody would accuse that person of being against automobile ownership. But imagine if the government did nationalize automobile production and became the sole distributor of automobiles. It would not be a stretch to imagine that leftists would immediately decry those who opposed government control over automobile ownership as being against poor people having cars and being immoral for wanting to remove such provisions. It's as if all the government has to do is begin providing or distributing something, anything, for as little as 5 minutes, and then it immediately becomes an act of immoral selfishness and maybe even a rights violation to call for its reversal. But healthcare and education are different than having a car, leftists will say. These things are essential public goods that government should provide. Well, would you agree that things like food and shelter also fall into that category? Anyone who says today that he would be against single-payer grocery stores or construction contracting would likely not be labeled as being against food and shelter. But let's say the government decided to take over food and shelter distribution in the way that they've done for education, and the way leftists want to do for healthcare. Again, it would not be shocking for people who oppose this new arrangement to now be lambasted as selfish enemies of humanity. Why is it constantly assumed by leftists that the state is the only viable way to solve societal problems, despite overwhelming factual evidence otherwise? I really don't know. One day, 2 Soviet Russian women were standing in a bread line. One says to the other, "The state bread queue sure is long today." The other turns to her and says, "You should be thankful, Comrade Dochka. In capitalist West, ptui, the state doesn't provide any bread." Thanks for watching.